Hel- Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Walter Block. How are you doing, Walter?
Pretty good. I'm delighted to be with you, Lipton.
I'm happy. I'm elated. I've been a fan of your pieces forever. Now, Walter, we're going to start by discussing one of your famous books, Defending the Indefensible. Tell us about slumlords.
Well, thank you. That's, I think, my first book, Defending the Undefendable 1. I now have published Defending the Undefendable 2, and Defending the Undefendable 3 is now with the publisher. So we'll have plenty to talk about the slumlord. Well, a lot of people think the slumlord is bad because there are broken windows and the heat doesn't always work, and maybe there's not hot and cold running water, and it's pretty crummy accommodation. But by the fact that somebody rents a slum dwelling indicates that that's the best opportunity that he sees is open to himself, because if he saw something better, he would have moved out of the slum and taken a non-slum apartment, or he would have moved into a different apartment with maybe the same quality but a lower rent. uh, so the question is the slumlord a menace, a violator of rights of the tenant, or is he a benefactor, a beneficiary? And it seems clear to me that he's a benefactor, because suppose that the slumlord and his apartment just disappeared in a puff of smoke. What would happen to the tenant? The tenant would now have to go to his next best opportunity, not the one that he was at the slum, but something a little worse, because he rejected that in favor of the slum. So the slumlord is a benefactor, and we shouldn't be criticizing him at all. Now, we not only have slum housing, but we have slum cars, 20-year-old Ford Falcons. We have slum clothing, namely in Yiddish, it's called a shmata, namely not high quality clothing. Are those people to be denigrated? Are they to be castigated? Are they to be blamed? No, it's the same thing. Whenever you have low grade stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people think that McDonald's is low grade compared to Commander's Palace. Commander's Palace is one of the best restaurants in New Orleans, where I'm from. And sometimes I go there, mainly when other people pay. And sometimes I go to a low grade McDonald's. And I'm not above having a McDonald's hamburger, but the McDonald's hamburger is a very cheap food. It's pretty good. I think you get your money's worth. But then again, what the slumlord provides is cheap housing. And in the eyes of the tenant, it's a good deal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. So what we're really doing is attacking low quality food. I mean, Walmart is a low quality compared to other groceries that are higher quality. Nothing wrong with low quality. Nothing wrong with buying a used car. A used car is a slum car in effect. It breaks down more often. So I think that would be the defense of the slumlord.
All right, and I agree with you to an extent. Living in a slum could be a stepping stone to buying a better house. So let's say, for example, John Brown is from Nigeria, or right, and John Brown migrates to America. He gets a job at McDonald's, and he can only afford a slum. So slums are serving ordinary people who are unable to live in mansions. They have to work before they can purchase a mansion, and then because of personality differences, maybe we can join an agreement with the slumlord to get him to improve the product. Isn't that possible? Some
Yes,
slumlords are reasonable.
yes. Well, I think all slumlords want to maximize profits. I think we can trust them on that.
And
Well,
because
how
they
do you?
want
I'm sorry.
yeah, and because they're motivated to maximize profits, they may transform the slums.
Well, possibly they'll transform them and improve them, but possibly not. But the point is that the way to maximize profits is to satisfy customers. and get them a good deal. And possibly the slum will just stay there. Now, look, this guy from Nigeria who just comes to the U.S. If there were no slum housing, he might have to be homeless. He might have to live on the street and get a cardboard box and sleep on the cardboard box or something like that. So the slum, living in a slum is better than living on the street uh, with no roof over your head, and if it rains or it's cold, you're in very bad shape. So I think you're making a very good point. With a very poor immigrant from Nigeria comes to this country, and he has the choice of a mansion which he can't afford, or a slum which he can't afford, or living in the street which he could afford because it costs nothing, but it's dangerous and it's bad for your health to live on the street. So I think a slumlord can be defended, and that's how I would defend him. That's how I did defend him in this book.
All right, Walter. But can rent control turn pristine properties into slums?
Rent control is not a good policy. My PhD dissertation was on rent control, as it just happens. And what rent control does is it keeps prices below equilibrium. And if prices are below equilibrium, the demand is greater than supply, which means there's a housing shortage. You don't really want to have a housing shortage, because a housing shortage means more people have to live on the streets, and you don't want to have homeless people, because living on the streets is very dangerous. Um, a lot of people think, well, Bernie Sanders, my old high school buddy Bernie Sanders, he favors rent control. He wants rent control everywhere, and very strict rent control. Well, if look, Lipton, suppose your Aunt Tilly just left you $10 million, and you can invest it in anything you want. You can invest it in McDonald's shares. You can invest it in toys, in shoes, or you can invest it in real estate. And in real estate, you could invest it in commercial buildings or office towers, or in residential units. And I tell you that rent control has never been applied anywhere else except residential rental units. Well, you're more likely to invest it into a shopping mall, or a factory, or a store, or a high-rise office tower. You're going to avoid residential rental units like the plague. Well, if we have in other words, rent control is sort of like a red light for investment in building. What we want, if we have the welfare of tenants in mind, we want more housing. We want people to build more residential units, because if the supply curve shifts to the right, if I can use economic terminology, if we have more housing, prices of rent will go down. But if you have rent control, people are less likely to build new rental units, and they're also less likely to maintain the buildings that they have, because a lot of rent control units laws provide that if a tenant leaves, you can then raise the rent. Well, one way to get the tenant to leave is to make it miserable for the tenant, and that's not helping the tenant. Now, a Bernie Sanders rent control would not allow the rent to rise even when a tenant left, but that would even exacerbate the problem more. Then people would try to convert their apartments to other purposes. They would try to make them condos, but then Bernie Sanders would say, you can't do that. Well, if the more you penalize landlords for who own residential rental units, the less residential rental units we'll have. And, eventually we're not going to have any, and then everyone's going to be homeless, or we'll have to have public housing. And then people say, well, the reason we have to have public housing is because the market failed. Well, the market didn't fail. The market plus rent control is not the market, and the market plus rent control is what failed.
All right, I agree with you, Dr. Walter. And let me give an example. So in Jamaica, taxi men have been victims of a price control for over 7 years. And as we do know, when a price control is instituted, people are not motivated to perform. So in Jamaica, when you're in the square to get a taxi, the taxi men tend to be erratic. 1 minute they are going to place A, the next minute they're going to place B, and when it rains, their schedule is changed completely. And I think that this can be attributed to the price control. If the price control did not exist, we would have more taximen transporting people to relevant communities. But because of price control, they refuse to go to certain areas. So let's say, for example, you want to go to place B, but because of the price control, the taxi man will only go to place C. So even if he has to traverse through your community to get to the to get to his route of objective, he's not going to take you. And
Right. I mean, this is exactly correct. Whenever you have a price ceiling, you're discouraging people from supplying. Look, suppose we had a rule that no hamburger could be sold for more than 25 cents. Right now, a McDonald's hamburger costs, I don't know, $1, $1.50, or $2, something like that. We pass a law saying that these prices are too high, $3, $4 too high, 25 cents. Well, what kind of a hamburger can we get for 25 cents? A very, very thin hamburger where you could see through it. If we could get it at all, and maybe McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's would have to go broke. So how is that helping customers who can't really afford a burger to have a price control of 25 cents? Now, it sounds good. I mean, Bernie Sanders might like this. You might say, well, McDonald's is exploiting people. It's charging $3 for a hamburger or $2 for a hamburger or whatever it is. We have to lower the price. Well, if we lower the price to 25 cents, we're not going to have any takeout hamburgers. And before McDonald's came, the poor couldn't afford to go out and have a meal at a restaurant. Now, poor people, even relatively poor people, can go to McDonald's, go to Burger King, go to Wendy's, have pizza, whatever. But if we start having price controls on food like that, well, then we're not going to have restaurants for poor people, and you can apply this to anything. I mean, right now shoes cost anywhere from, I don't know, $20 to $500. Suppose we said that the maximum price for a shoe is $1. Well, you're not going to have many shoes, and if you have them, maybe they'll just be thongs or something like that, very, very cheap shoes. So you're quite right to extrapolate from rental units to taxi cabs, and all I'm doing is following in your footsteps and extrapolating and applying it to, you can apply it to anything. Right now, Loyola University charges, I don't know, 40,000 tuition. Suppose the law was that Loyola could only charge $4 annual tuition. Well, Loyola would either have to stop, go bankrupt, or the quality of education would be ridiculously low.
all right. Walter, what is driving costs in higher education in the States? Because I live in a foreign country, and when you compare prices in Jamaica to the States, Jamaica is extremely cheap, woefully cheap, embarrassingly cheap.
Well, one of the reasons driving tuition high is government subsidies. Government is heavily subsidizing education. Um, Another one is, I guess, um, well, I'm not really sure about that. Why Jamaica would be cheap, and do they subsidize education
Yeah,
in
the state the state in Jamaica and the broader Caribbean provides resources to universities, but the issue is that in the Caribbean we don't have census regulations.
I see.
So American professors have to comply with a litany of regulations and rules. And the system of tertiary education in the Caribbean is not overly regulated.
I see. That's interesting. I'm not really that familiar with the education in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so you can start a university, get professors. You're not told by the state that you must spend 10 million to build a new facility. Jamaica does not have those type of cosmetic regulations.
Well, education is pretty cheap in the U.S. in 2-year public colleges, community colleges. Some of them are very, very cheap, and they're heavily subsidized by the government. So if the government subsidizes them, then the tuition that the students have to pay will be much lower.
But if the schools are not subject to regulations, then they don't need to pass on expensive to students in the form of fees.
Right. Well, at one time, uh, there might be 100 professors and there might be 3 administrators. And
Yes.
now the number of administrators is roughly equal to the number of professors. And, they have administrators to worry
Or
about
diversity.
diversity and this and that and complying with all sorts of government regulations. Very much so, diversity and affirmative action and things like that. So that might be another reason why private education is so expensive.
Exactly, I agree with you. But now I would like to talk about prostitution. Some aver that criticizing prostitution is consistent with Christianity, but I disagree. Tell us, Walter, why should we allow prostitutes to sell their service?
Well, I don't really favor
Neither
prostitution.
do I. Neither do I.
I don't go to a prostitute. I have a daughter. I wouldn't want her to be a prostitute. I think a much better way for men and women to interact is not through prostitution. However, should a prostitute go to jail
No.
for consensual behavior with an adult? And I'm a libertarian, and libertarians believe in the non-aggression principle as the basis of law. And what should be prohibited by law is murder, rape, theft, arson, kidnapping, fraud, pickpocketing, things like that.
Vices
But
that affect our rights. That's what Aquinas said.
that's right. That's exactly right. I fully agree with you and enthusiastically agree with you. Prostitution is not a rights violation. And when you have laws against prostitution, it's unsafe for the prostitute because they can't go to the police for protection. It's unsafe for the client, the John, because you don't know the quality of the prostitution. In Europe, prostitution is legal in many countries, and in Nevada, except for Las Vegas, prostitution is legal. And there's no crisis. There's no black market. There's no difficulties. There's no crime involved with that. Now, again, as conservatives and libertarians, we don't have to favor prostitution, but we have to favor the legalization of prostitution. And there's a gigantic difference between that and those two. And a lot of people erroneously think that if you want to legalize it, you have to favor it. And you don't. We can oppose it and still favor the legalization of it. I mean, it's the same with cocaine or marijuana or heroin. I don't favor using heroin. I don't favor using any of those addictive drugs. But should people go to jail for it? Well, at one time we had laws against alcohol. We had prohibition, and we had bathtub gin, and people were dying and shooting each other over turf. Well, now we have, it's interesting. When it was prohibition of alcohol, it was young Italians shooting each other over turf. Now it's disproportionately young black men shooting each other over drug turf. And nowadays, if you want to buy some alcohol, you just go to the grocery and nobody's shooting anyone over it. And the quality is, there's no poison in there except, the alcohol isn't good for you, but it's not poisonous. But nowadays, you have heroin that can kill you, and people are shooting each other over it. So it's very similar with these victimless crimes, whether it's prostitution or drugs or alcohol or any of that. It should be legal, but it doesn't mean that we favor the use thereof.
All right. And this is for the Christians. Let me read an excerpt from an old article. Saint Antonio of Florence, a 15th century Dominican, noted that many sinful contracts are permitted for the good of the republic, although this does not mean that the acts are good. Prostitutes sin by prostituting themselves, he said, but not by receiving payment for doing so. And reason Jesuit Antonio de Escobar a century later. Although the sale of a prostitute's favors is evil, it causes pleasure, and things that cause pleasure merit a price. So if you're a Christian, personally, you should not support prostitution, but it's silly to oppose legalizing prostitution.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant point about if you can do something, it's okay. But then if you get paid for it, then it's sort of not okay. Let's take a very different example. Kidney transplantation. If I need a kidney, Lipton, and you donate a kidney of yours to me, no problem. No law has been violated. Everything is okay. It was a voluntary gift, and I thank you for it. I don't really need your kidney. Mine are working okay. But if you give me a kidney of yours, Lipton, and I pay you 100,000 for it, all of a sudden we're violating the law. Well, how did that happen? It's the same thing. In both cases, you gave me your kidney. And in one case, you did it for free and it's not a violation of law. And in the other case, I paid you for it. And now all of a sudden it becomes a violation of law. Why should it be just because you pay for something? If you donate X to me, if you give me X, that's okay. And if you sell me X, that's not okay. I mean, it's the same with blood, transfusion of blood. Somehow, what's the rule? Commodifiable, commodification. Somehow, commodification is evil. If you buy and sell something, that's evil. Whereas if you give something away, that's okay. This is just an attack on the free enterprise system. So I'm very glad that what was it, Aquinas?
Thomas Aquinas and some other scholastics.
Thomas Aquinas was absolutely right. Why, just because you pay for something that is otherwise legal, does it turn it illegal?
Yeah, and the others are Saint Antonio of Florence and Antonio de Escobar.
Well, I'm a fan of these people.
Yes, but Walter, I've been thinking about drugs for a long time, and I'm surprised that more libertarians are not proposing a decentralized alternative to solving the drug problem. So, for example, it is often said that if we legalize drugs, we're going to encourage murder and criminality, but this is not so. Druggists should be allowed to create professional institutions with rules and regulations, and druggists who decide to defraud their colleagues will then be subject to these rules. What do you think about this proposal?
Well, if your proposal is we legalize all drugs, I certainly favor it. Is that your proposal?
Yes, not only legalizing all drugs, but ensuring that druggists can create their own professional organizations with standards. So druggists are monitoring themselves. So if one commits a crime in the community, then he will be punished by a group if he opts to form an association or paid dues.
Well, I'm not against druggists associations, but if a druggist purposely poisons a drug and sells it to me,
that's a crime.
Yes, precisely. That's a crime, and the penalty should not just be that his fellow druggists remove him from their group. This leads me to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration.
Yes.
Right now, we have a Food and Drug Administration in the United States. I'm sure that in the Caribbean there are analogous organizations.
Not on the state of the FDA. Jamaica has a Bureau of Standards, but its role is different from the FDA. But the Caribbean doesn't have these agencies with tyrannical powers.
Well, I oppose the FDA. I mean, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States says that in order for a drug to be sold, it has to be approved by them. But suppose I have terminal cancer. I have fourth stage cancer, and I want to take a chance on an experimental drug, Lipton, that you're now selling. The FDA for many years would not allow me to even try. But nowadays, the FDA has changed, and they have a new rule saying, a last chance, last gasp chance, and they will allow me to try. Well, that's very decent of them, but for many years they wouldn't allow me to try. And why should only people with terminal cancer or terminal diseases have a right to try? Shouldn't anyone be able to try anything? Now, look, if the FDA just said, look, we don't approve of this, That would be an improvement rather than prohibiting the sale of pharmaceuticals. They just don't give their imprimatur, they don't give their approval to it. That would be better than the present system. But even better than that, why should the FDA be a monopoly? Shouldn't we have many laboratories that either approve or don't approve? Shouldn't we have a competitive industry? Because look, suppose the FDA makes a mistake, and they made a mistake with thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug that helped women with morning sickness. They didn't vomit as much in the first trimester, but a very small number of babies came out with difficulties, birth defects. Well, if we had a competitive industry approving of drugs, and one industry, the Acme company for drugs, made a big mistake, well, then they'd leave, and the remainder would be pretty good. I mean, that's why we have pretty good shirts and pretty good shoes and pretty good hamburgers, because we have competition. Well, shouldn't we have competition in the approval of drugs and the certification of the quality of drugs? Why leave it in? Why put all of our eggs in one FDA basket?
Yeah, the policies of the FDA are predicated on warped reasoning. So, for example, a surgery is a risk. The chance may be 75% or 50% or even lower. Therefore, it is insensible to argue that one cannot consume a drug because of the risk. That doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. I certainly agree with you on this. The FDA is a very bad idea, and should be banned.
But Walter, this is the issue. Some matters may appear complicated, but they're quite simple. But to understand a complicated matter, you must be able to give a simple example. And people these days are unable to extrapolate or identify the parallels between competing claims. It's just the age in which we live. But back to your book, Defending the Indefensible. Tell us about the ghetto merchant.
Well, the ghetto merchant is very similar to the slumlord. The ghetto merchant is selling low price goods, and people are objecting to that. A lot of the trouble. I'm familiar with the New York City situation. I used to live in New York City, and in Harlem and in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which are black areas. It used to be that there were Jewish people who were running the grocery stores, and the black people didn't much like that, and they would sometimes rob from them. And then Orientals, uh, East Asians would run the grocery stores, and again, this was resented. And the problem then, what happens is, if the people shoplift, and I just heard that in San Francisco, Walgreens shut down 17 Walgreens pharmacies because of shoplifting, and they passed laws in California that if you shoplift, it's not really a crime. Well, then what you have is a food desert. Namely, if the small groceries can't operate there, and the large Walmarts don't want to locate there, well, then the people in these poor communities have to go miles and miles away to get their groceries. Uh, uh, so again, I ask, is the ghetto merchant a benefactor or a harm to people, poor people in these local communities? And the way to answer is, suppose that the ghetto merchant just leaves or doesn't open a store in the first place.
He's a
Are the
national
people?
hero.
Yes, they're heroes for locating there, and helping the poor, giving them groceries or selling them groceries, obviously. But if you look at it through the eyeglasses of if they leave, if they drop dead, if they never open their ghetto groceries in the first place, would the people in the inner cities be better off or worse off? And it's obvious they would be worse off. So these are benefactors. They ought to be appreciated. And due to economic illiteracy, they're not appreciated. And that's one of the reasons that my book, Defending the Undefendable, tries to defend them, and even call them heroic, because they are doing legitimate things in the face of great opposition.
The ghetto merchant must account for insurance costs, and crime. So, for example, in Jamaica, the Chinese created the retail sector. Merchants function as middlemen, and they're often minority groups. And in their absence, others may be unwilling to start businesses. So I like to get a merchant. I don't.
Yes, yeah,
I
we certainly agree on that.
He's very very entrepreneurial. But Walter, recently you published another dazzling book. I want you to talk to us about water capitalism. Why should we privatize everything?
Well, my motto is if it moves, privatize
Yeah.
it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. And I have 3 books on my privatization series. One is we should privatize roads and highways. Another is we should privatize the space race and the moon and Mars when we get there.
I'm
And
getting to
also,
those. I'm getting to those eventually.
okay, good. And also rivers, lakes, oceans, whatever. Well, we had Katrina, a storm in 2005. And actually, the storm didn't hit New Orleans. It landed maybe 40 miles east of us in Mississippi. It did some damage in New Orleans, and 1,900 people died. But did they die because of Katrina? No, they died because the levees put in by the Army Corps of Engineers failed, and the water overturned, and I mean, New Orleans is in a bowl. It's below sea level. From my house in New Orleans, I could see ships that are above the land because the water is higher. Well, if 1,900 people were killed by McDonald's, McDonald's would end. Now, the humanist part of me, the Wales, is unhappy that 1,900 people died. But the economist in me is very unhappy that the people responsible for those deaths are still in business. Whereas in the marketplace, if you kill 1,900 people, that's it for you. We get a different group of people. So we should privatize the Mississippi River. Why should we privatize the Gulf of Mexico? Why should we privatize the Atlantic and the Pacific? Well, there are several reasons. One of them is, in the Soviet Union, when they had collectivized farms, the collectivized farms were 97% of the arable land, and they produced 75% of the crops. And in the 3% of the land that was privately owned, they produced 25% of the crops, a very gigantic disproportion. Well, it's similar with the oceans and the land. The oceans are 3/4 of the Earth's surface. The land is 1/4. And on the oceans, we produce 1% of the world GDP, and on the land, 99% of the GDP. So now this is not exactly fair because most of the people are on the land, not in the ocean. But I think it's fair to say that the oceans are not contributing their fair share of the GDP. If they were private, they would produce more. Why? Well, one reason is this thing called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is that if the oceans is unowned, and right now the oceans are unowned, there are only 3 ways to go: either unowned, run by government, or run privately. And I favor private ownership. Well, when they're unowned, you have the tragedy of the commons. What's the tragedy of the commons? Well, if it's unowned, like the fish, people will overfish because why should I leave any fish over for you? I might as well grab all the fish, and you feel the same way. But if we each grab all the fish and we don't save any for tomorrow, because I don't want to save any for tomorrow because you're going to grab them, and you don't want to save any for tomorrow because I'm going to grab them, well, there'll be no more fish. It's very similar to why the buffalo almost went extinct, and the cow never came within a million miles of being extinct because cows were privately owned, and buffalo were never privately, until recently, were never privately owned. So if you slaughtered a cow, you wouldn't have a cow tomorrow. If you slaughtered a buffalo, it costs you nothing because you wouldn't have had the buffalo anyway. So we have overfishing in the ocean, and that's one of the reasons that we have to have fishing seasons. Because and then what they do is they have really better boats and better nets, so they catch even more fish, and then they have to reduce the fishing season. This is just a waste of resources. We don't have cow seasons or chicken seasons. You can slaughter a cow or a chicken whenever you want. So the reason there are two reasons to privatize water. One is you'll save lives, given the Mississippi River case with Katrina, and the other is we'll have more wealth, and we want to have more wealth. But instead, the United Nations has this law of the sea that everybody owns one n over the population. The oceans are the common heritage of all mankind. That means unowned, and then we have the tragedy of the commons. So yes, I favor the privatization of the oceans,
I,
rivers, lakes, aquifers, everything.
I agree with you, Walter, but what do you say to your critics who may contend that privatizing the oceans could create monopolies?
Well, that's an interesting question, and there's a whole literature on monopolies. The way many people see monopoly is ownership of a high proportion of something. The way I think the proper way to look at monopoly is that it's a grant of government privilege. But look, who is going to get to, let's say, the Mississippi River? Who is going to get to own the Mississippi River? Well, if we follow John Locke and Murray Rothbard, homesteading theory would determine who is the owners. Well, who are the people that would own the Mississippi River? Well, everybody who has land on this either side of the Mississippi River would own one share for every mile of frontage. And then all the people that have boats going up and down the Mississippi River in proportion to how many boats they have and the tonnage of the boats, they would own it. So the Mississippi River would now be a stock company owned by, I don't know, 1 million different people. Well, how about the Atlantic Ocean? Who would own the Atlantic Ocean? Well, anyone on the in the Caribbean on the coast, and on the U.S. on the coast, and on Western Europe on the coast, and that's millions of people would now own the Atlantic Ocean. It would be a stock company, the Atlantic Ocean Corporation. Now, they would determine who gets to go and how much you have to pay. So they're not going to have a rule saying, well, no boats can go in there, or if a boat wants to go from I don't know, from Europe to New York, they're going to have to pay $1 million or something like that, because the very people who own it would be the people who are using the ocean. So I don't think that the monopoly objection is a valid objection.
And I agree, it is not a valid objection. Monopolies are usually the result of government privileges. Secondly, because of competitive markets, these individual owners of oceans would be motivated to produce a better product. They would not be encouraged to discriminate against people on silly bases. So for example, people who discriminate in business are more likely to lose. The Diva Pager, I believe that's her name, she did a study, it was a follow-up study, and she found that businesses that engaged in negative discrimination were less likely to survive. So discrimination on certain grounds does not pay in the market. So I agree with you.
Well,
The entrepreneurs wouldn't be motivated to discriminate.
Well, there are three people who are my mentors, my gurus in this area of economics of discrimination. One of them is Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize winner. Another is Thomas Sowell, a Black economist from Hoover Institution. Another is the late Walter Williams, a friend of mine, a co-author of mine. These three people have done more to explain exactly what you say, that discrimination is impotent to hurt the target of discrimination. Because look, suppose whites and blacks have equal productivity of $10 an hour, and they're both paid $10 an hour, and there's no discrimination. And all of a sudden we introduce discrimination, and now because of discrimination, black people are making $7 an hour, and white people are still making $10 an hour. And again, their productivity is equal at $10 an hour. Well, if you hire a white person, you make no profit, because you have to pay them 10 and they produce 10. If you hire a black person, you pay them 7 and they produce 10, you make a profit off of them of $3. Well, Lipton, if you hire a black person for 7, I'm going to offer him 701. and you're going to offer him 702, and I'm going to offer him 703. Where's this bidding war going to end? It's going to end at $10. So the real problem of wage gap for men and women or blacks and whites is not discrimination. It's a complicated issue explanation, but it's not discrimination, as Becker, Soule, and Williams have demonstrated over and over and over again.
Exactly my point. Racists may dislike non-whites or people who don't look like them, but they love money more. During slavery in Jamaica, Barbados, and the American South, white men purchased goods from the enslaved. People care more about their own utility than racism.
And if they don't, they lose money.
Exactly my point.
And if they lose money, then they have less and less to say about what happens. You're exactly right on this. People discriminate in favor of green.
Exactly.
Green isn't money.
And the academic who did the fascinating follow-up study, her name is Diva Pager. I just want to get it right for our listeners. Now, Walter, discrimination is not always wrong. If I'm a businessman and my manager must be traveling twice a week, however, the manager decided to take a more lucrative job, therefore I need to employ someone else. My candidates are very good. I have a man and a woman. They're both equally competent, but I prefer the woman. However, if the woman is visibly pregnant, I may not employ her because that is stress. If I care about her and the baby, it makes sense to not employ her. And because of my business, I require someone who is agile. So discrimination is not inapplicable in all circumstances.
Well, I would hardly call that discrimination. I would call that I don't know, good entrepreneurship. I mean,
good logic.
Logic, yes, that would be the way to put it. Let's talk just a little bit about the wage gap between men and women.
I'm glad that you're bringing it up.
Okay, good. Well, you pushed me in that direction. The wage gap between men and women is something like 25, 30%, maybe 20%. The ratio varies every once in a while. And we have two theories to try to explain why it is that men earn more than women on average. Look, you have to say on average, because look, men are taller than women on average. Men are heavier than women on average. Men are stronger than women on average. There are some women karate people that could probably toss you and me both around. But on average, men are stronger, heavier, and taller than women. Well, on average, men earn, say, 20% more than women, on average. Now, look, Oprah Winfrey is a woman, and she earns more than you and I put together, I'm sure. I don't know how much you make, but if it's anything like me, Oprah Winfrey makes a lot more than we make. So it's always on average. Well, so one theory is that men are in charge of corporations and men hate women and discriminate against women, although most men that I know, if there's any discrimination, they would discriminate the exact opposite way because they see men as competitors and women as non-competitors with them, at least heterosexual men. But there are two interesting points. One of them is the ratio for all men and all women is 20%. There's a gap. However, we now have this other thing called the marital asymmetry hypothesis. And the marital asymmetry hypothesis says that the reason for the gap is because of marriage, because there's unequal sharing of housekeeping and cooking and cleaning and childcare and obviously pregnancy and breastfeeding and stuff like that, that men do much, much less than women. And whenever you have, this is a concept in economics called alternative or opportunity cost. Whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well or at all. Usain Bolt is the fastest man on the planet in the 100 yards.
And he's very charismatic. So this attributes for his wealth. He's very charismatic.
He's very charismatic, but they really should give him a speeding ticket because he goes so fast. he does the 100 meters in 9 seconds or 9.5 or something crazy. But is he a good cellist? Probably not, because he doesn't play the cello. He's busy running and doing weightlifting. Whereas Yo-Yo Ma is the best cellist on the planet. And what's his time in the 100? Probably not that good. So whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well. Well, if women are doing a disproportionate share of the housekeeping and cooking and cleaning and everything else as they are, well, then they can't be as good at the as they.
Hello? Walter? Hel- Hello, Walter?
Yes, I'm here.
You're back. Okay, you can continue.
Okay, good. So what I was saying is that when women bear a disproportionate share of the housekeeping and the cooking and the cleaning and the childcare, they have to do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well. So the wage gap of say 20% between men and women is all men and all women. But if you take ever married men and women, namely widowed, divorced, separated, or presently married, the gap is way more than 20%, something like 50.
Okay. Walter? Walter? Hello, Walter? You need to come back. The hell? Not sure. What happened? Like, zoom in naman.